The last normal thing I did was staple together a stack of incident reports. That's it. That's what I was doing when everything came apart. Sitting in the nurse's station on the 3rd floor with a swing-line stapler and a cup of coffee that had gone cold around midnight, trying to document the blood product chain of custody from a mass casualty event that had burned through our trauma bays for most of the previous 6 hours. Paperwork. At 2:14 in the morning. Because on night shift, the paperwork doesn't do itself, and nobody else was going to do it, and I'd been doing it alone for 11 years, so I need to back up a little. I'm recording this because Brendan found a voice recorder in the fire station office and gave it to me and said, "You should get this down while it's still clear in your head." That was his way of saying he could tell I was starting to loop. I'd been waking up at 3 in the morning and sitting against the wall and replaying certain moments over and over, the way you do when your brain is trying to file something and can't figure out what folder it belongs in. He noticed. Brendan notices things. So I've got this recorder, and I'm going to try to talk through all of it from the beginning. And if this reaches anyone, if you're listening to this somewhere safe and dry, and you have food and you're okay, I hope it helps you understand what those first days were like inside a hospital. Because I don't think people out there know. I don't think anyone knew what was happening to the hospitals first. My name is Joanna Kessler. I was, an RN, 11 years in emergency medicine, the last 8 of those on the night shift at Mercy General Hospital in the city. I'm 37. I have a cat named Gerald, who I am choosing to believe is fine, and has found his way to somewhere with mice and dry weather. I was never married. I have a sister in Portland, who I haven't heard from since day 2, and I am not going to talk about that right now. The night it started, I was finishing my shift, or trying to. We'd had a major incident earlier. A 5-car pileup on the interstate. 2 semi-trucks involved. 12 patients total. 3 of them critical. That had been my night from about 7:30 until 1 in the morning. After that, the ER got quiet in that specific way it gets quiet after a mass event. That hollow, drained-out quiet where everyone who's still standing is running on reflex, and nobody's talking, because talking takes energy that nobody has left. The trauma bays had been cleaned and restocked. Most of the victims from the pileup were either in surgery, in the ICU, or in the morgue. 2 of them were in the morgue, a 44-year-old man named Daniel Forsyth and a 16-year-old girl, whose name I'm not going to say, because if her family is ever alive and wondering, I don't want her name floating around on a recording as a casualty. She'd been in the passenger seat. She'd been on her way home from something. I don't know what. You don't usually know those things. So I was sitting in the station doing paperwork and the floor was quiet, and I was planning what I was going to eat when I got home, because I'd been thinking about that scrambled egg situation since about 11 p.m., and the overhead lights were doing that thing they always do on night shift, where they feel slightly too bright in a way that makes your eyeballs hurt, and that was my life. That was everything. Then the code alarm went off from the morgue. Not from a patient room, not from a trauma bay, from the morgue. For a second, I just looked at the board. The board shows you the room and the bed and the alert type, and everything was correct. It was coming from the morgue refrigeration unit area on the lower level, bed designation M2. And I thought, that's not a bed, that's a drawer. They label the morgue drawers as beds in the system, which I've always thought was a strange choice. But whatever, nobody asked me. The first thing you think, the very first thing any nurse thinks, when something impossible shows up on the board, is that it's a system error. Equipment malfunctions. Sensors give false readings. Cardiac monitors occasionally throw codes when the lead falls off. That's usually what it is. I thought that. I sat there for a moment and thought, loose lead, false reading. And then I thought, there are no leads on a morgue drawer. And then I was already reaching for the intercom. I called down to the lower level. We had a morgue attendant on overnights, a man named Carl, who was somewhere in his 50s, and who I'd spoken to maybe 30 times in 8 years, always about the same bureaucratic nothing: body transfer paperwork, ID verification, storage capacity. He answered on the 3rd buzz, which was slower than usual, and his voice was wrong. Not scared, not panicked, just off, like someone talking while trying to listen to something else. "Carl, I've got an alert from M2, I said. You seeing anything down there? He said, yeah, I was just about to call up. Pause. You should probably send someone down. What's going on? Another pause, and in that pause I could hear something in the background. A sound I couldn't identify immediately, because it didn't belong there. A low, wet, rhythmic knocking, like someone bumping against something hollow, over and over, methodically, without urgency. Carl. Mr. Forsyth, he said, and his voice was very careful. The drawer is, I think there's a problem with the latch, or... He stopped talking. I heard him make a sound that I'm going to describe as surprised, because I don't have a better word for it. Not scared, just surprised. The way you sound when something you weren't expecting happens faster than your brain can categorize it. Then the line went dead. I sat there for maybe 4 seconds. In 11 years of ER nursing, you develop a particular kind of reflex that isn't exactly bravery and isn't exactly stupidity. It's just the thing that happens when your body knows before your brain does that the next few minutes are going to require movement. I was already around the counter before I'd fully decided to go. I grabbed the phone handset for the third-floor intercom and put out a general call for any available staff to the lower level, and I took the stairwell because the elevators at 2 a.m. are slow, and I went down. The lower level of Mercy General is a place that takes some getting used to. It's underground, which means no windows, which means even during the day it feels like night down there. The lighting is fluorescent and old, the kind that buzzes slightly if you pay attention. The corridor that connects the morgue to the hospital service elevator has scuffed beige linoleum that's been scuffed the same way for at least 15 years. It smells like floor cleaner, and something underneath floor cleaner that the floor cleaner is not quite covering. I'd been down there many times for various reasons. Body transfers, equipment storage, once to help maintenance fix a stuck door, and it always felt the same way, like a place that existed only functionally, not as somewhere anyone was meant to actually spend time. I pushed through the morgue door, and the first thing I registered was that Carl was on the floor by the refrigeration unit. He was sitting, that's the right word, sitting, with his back against the cabinet and his legs straight out in front of him. His face was turned away from me, toward the wall. His right hand was pressed flat against his leg in a weird way, too tight, the kind of pressure you apply to something that hurts. There was blood coming through his fingers. Not a lot, enough to see. I said, Carl, and went to him, and he turned his head toward me, and his face was, he looked confused. That's the only word. Confused and pale, and like he was having trouble tracking where I was, relative to where the pain was. It bit me, he said. And I thought, it bit me, he said again, quieter. Forsyth. His drawer was open, and I thought it was the latch, and then he was sitting up, and he exhaled, sharp, through his nose. Joanna, he was dead. I processed him. He was dead 2 hours ago. I looked over at the refrigeration unit. Drawer M2 was open, hanging all the way out on its track. The drawer was empty. The body bag had been partially unzipped from the inside, which I will tell you right now is not something body bags do on their own. I looked around the rest of the room. The room has 2 doors, the one I'd come through, and a second one on the far wall that leads to the body transport area where they load gurneys. That second door was open, a crack, maybe 6 inches. Where did he go? I asked. Carl didn't answer. When I looked back at him, I could already see that something was changing in his face. The confusion was smoothing out into something flatter. His eyes were going somewhere. Not closed, not quite. Just going somewhere that wasn't here. Carl, look at me. Hey. I crouched in front of him and put my hand on his face to turn it toward me. His skin was already wrong. Not cold yet, not dead, but cooling faster than shock alone explains. How bad is the bite? Let me see. He let me move his hand, and I looked at the wound on his forearm. A human bite, which are always worse than people think. Deep, ragged, and already bruising around the edges in a way that's unusual for a fresh wound. But it was survivable. It was the kind of thing that needed cleaning and antibiotics and stitches, not the kind of thing that should be putting him on the floor. I feel, he started. He stopped. He closed his eyes all the way. "Carl, stay with me." I checked his pulse at his neck. Present. Weak but present. His breathing was shallow and fast, the way breathing gets when pain is the primary problem rather than injury severity. "I'm going to get help down here, okay? I'm going to—" The second door swung open all the way. Daniel Forsyth was standing in the doorway. I want to be precise about this because I have thought about it approximately 10,000 times since, and I want the record to be accurate. He was 44 years old, a construction foreman, and he had died at approximately 12:47 a.m. from blunt trauma to the head and thoracic injuries sustained in the pileup. I know this because I was there when Dr. Patrick called it. I know this because I initialed the death documentation myself. He had been in that drawer, in that body bag, legally and medically dead, for 1 hour and 23 minutes. He was standing in the doorway in his body bag, which had slid down around his waist. His chest was bare, and the injuries from the accident were visible. Bruising across his ribs and sternum, a sutured laceration on his left arm, from where one of the trauma team had made an unsuccessful surgical access. His head wound had been partially covered with a trauma dressing that had come askew. His eyes were open. They were not the eyes of someone who was alive. I know how to describe this now, but I didn't have the language for it in that moment. They were the wrong color. Not the color of the iris. That was the same brown it had been, but the wrong quality. Like looking at a photograph of eyes rather than actual eyes. No focus, no adjustment, just pointed in a direction. He was making a sound, very low. It wasn't a groan, and it wasn't a breath, and it wasn't a word. It was more like the sound a house makes when the pipes are under pressure. A sustained, low vibration from somewhere in his chest. Continuous, not varying. I said, "Mr. Forsyth," not because I thought he could hear me. Reflex. He didn't react to his name. He moved toward the sound I made. That is the important thing. He moved toward the sound, not toward me as a person, not toward Carl, not toward the door, toward the noise. I said a word and he turned and took 2 steps in that direction. I will come back to that later. Right now, just know that I noticed it. I grabbed the nearest thing with weight to it, a stainless steel instrument tray from the procedure cart next to the refrigeration unit, and I threw it at the far wall, away from me, as hard as I could. It hit with a crash and bounced and skittered across the floor, and Daniel Forsyth turned away from me and moved toward that sound instead. I grabbed Carl by the arm and hauled. He got his legs under him, barely, and we went through the door I'd come in through, and I got it shut behind us, and I found the door wedge that maintenance keeps in the hallway for when they're moving equipment, and I jammed it under the door, and I stood there in the corridor with Carl leaning against me, and I tried to think. That's the moment. That's the exact moment when I understood that tonight was not going to be a normal night. Not because of what I'd seen, not just because of that, but because of what I heard in the 60 seconds I stood in that corridor trying to gather myself. From above me, through the ceiling and the floor above it, I could hear, faintly but definitely, 2 things that should not have been happening simultaneously. The first was the code alarm, not just M2 anymore. Multiple rooms on the 2nd floor, 4, 5, maybe more, all going off in a rapid, overlapping sequence, like someone was running down the hallway triggering them one by one. The second was the PA system going quiet in the middle of a sentence. We always have low-level background PA activity at night. Transfer notifications, staff pages, the occasional overhead announcement. There'd been a voice mid-sentence, something about a pharmacy requisition, and it cut off. Clean cut. No static, no interruption, just gone. 2 generators. That hospital runs on 2 generators for exactly this reason. You don't want to lose power in an ER or a surgical floor. When the PA cuts like that, the backup should have kicked in within seconds. I counted. I got to 17 before the emergency lighting came on instead of the main lights, and that's not a generator failure. That's main building power failure. And at 2:30 in the morning, with nobody running heavy equipment, that shouldn't be happening. "Okay," I said to Carl, out loud, to organize myself as much as anything. "Okay." Carl was barely standing. The infection, whatever was in that bite, was moving through him faster than any infection I've ever seen in the field, and I've seen a lot. His skin temperature had dropped noticeably in the 3 minutes since I'd found him. He wasn't responding to his name anymore when I said it. He was upright, but he was going somewhere in his head, the same way Forsyth had gone somewhere. And I looked at him and made the calculation that a nurse with 11 years of experience and a functional brain makes automatically. He's not going to make it upstairs. I'm sorry, Carl. I'm sorry. I left him leaning against the wall. I checked that the morgue door was still wedged. I went to the service phone in the corridor and tried the extension for the second-floor nurses' station and got nothing, and tried the trauma bay desk and got nothing, and tried the main ER desk and got a busy signal, which is, a busy signal on a hospital internal line is not something you normally get. I took the stairwell up. The second floor was chaos. When I say chaos, I want to be specific, because chaos is a word that gets used loosely, and what I mean is non-patterned, rapidly escalating simultaneous events with no central organizing response, which is different from an emergency, which has a response system. What I walked into on the second floor was not an emergency with a response. It was several emergencies with no response at all. The nursing station was empty. The computer screens were on. They'd stayed up on backup power, and I could see that the alert board was showing codes in 4 rooms: 214, 2118, 223, and 229. Those rooms had all been occupied before I went downstairs. 214 was a 72-year-old cardiac patient named Gerald, not my cat, different Gerald, who'd been stable when I left him at midnight. 218 was a woman who'd been admitted for observation after the pileup, minor injuries, expected discharge in the morning. I went to 214 first, because it was closest. Gerald was not in his bed. The cardiac monitor leads had been pulled from their adhesive pads and were dangling loose against the bed rail, which is what triggers the code alert. The bed had the side rails down on the left side, and the sheets were, disturbed is the word, like he'd rolled out rather than stood up. Like getting his legs over the side and standing up had been more coordination than was available. I looked in the bathroom, empty. I looked in the hallway. Down the hallway, toward the far end, there were 2 people I didn't immediately recognize, because the emergency lighting is half the normal brightness, and everything was in that dim amber orange that makes faces look wrong. But as I stood there and my eyes adjusted, I realized the 2 people were both patients. I recognized the gowns. And they were moving wrong. Not walking. Not quite. More like walking had become a reflex, and the mind that usually made it fluid and purposeful was gone. So what was left was the mechanical action of it. Feet lifting and placing, arms not swinging properly, heads not turning naturally with the body, the whole thing happening at about half speed. One of them turned toward me, same as Forsyth, turned toward me because I was there and making sounds, not because they saw me or knew me. I went into 218. The woman from the pileup, her name was Tracy, I remembered, was still in her bed, but she was sitting up, and she was wrong in the same way, the same flattened face, and the same color to the eyes that I'd seen on Forsyth in the morgue. She had monitoring leads still attached. She was sitting up against them, the wires pulling taut. Tracy had had a concussion and a fractured radius. She had not, as of 90 minutes ago, been dead. She was dead now, in the way that mattered. She was dead in the way that comes back. I backed out of her room and shut the door, and I stood in that corridor for a moment and I said, out loud, into the empty hallway, "What is happening?" I wasn't asking anyone. I was saying it the way you say something when your brain needs to externalize it to process it, when the idea is too large to hold inside your head quietly, and you need to push it out through your mouth just to make it real. What I understood in that moment was this: the patients in this hospital, some of them, maybe more than I could yet see, were going through something that started with death and ended with a version of being alive that was not actually alive. That something passed from one of them to another through a bite. That it moved fast, faster than any vector I'd ever studied or treated. That it had started, was starting, in a hospital where people were already sick and weakened, and where the natural flow of fluids and physical contact between patients and staff was built into the structure of care. That this hospital was the worst place in the city to be right now. That was the first thing I understood clearly that night, and I still didn't entirely believe it, because understanding something conceptually and believing it emotionally are two different processes that don't always happen at the same time. But I understood it, and I started moving. The patients in the hallway were still down near the far end. I went the other direction, toward the stairwell that connects to the third floor. My floor. The floor where the pediatric overflow rooms were. The floor where I'd started my night. I needed to get to the phone system on 3, which had a direct line to the hospital administrator on call, and I needed to find out if there was anyone else still making decisions in this building. On the third floor landing, I nearly walked into Kyle. Kyle Waterman was 22, a nursing assistant who'd been working nights for about 4 months. He was from somewhere in Ohio, I think. Had told me once, but I hadn't retained it. And he had the specific kind of face that young men have when they're trying very hard to look like they're not scared, and not quite pulling it off. He was coming down the stairs from above with a fire extinguisher in each hand, which is not the weapon of choice I would have selected, but I understood the impulse. "Oh, thank God," he said when he saw me. His voice cracked slightly on the word God. "I've been trying to. The third floor is. There's people up there who are." "I know," I said. "What do we do?" And I want to be honest about this moment, because it's one of the ones I replay at 3 in the morning. What I said was, "I don't know yet. Give me 60 seconds. And the honest thing about that moment is that I absolutely did not know. I had no framework for this. Nobody does until they're in it. Everything I'd ever trained for in emergency medicine was about responding to the human body in crisis, keeping it alive, fighting for it. Nobody trains you for the opposite problem. Nobody gives you a protocol for when the thing you're fighting for turns into the thing you're fighting." 60 seconds was enough to establish the following. The phones to administration were down. The intercom PA was down. The hospital-wide radio system that security uses was working on backup power, and I could hear it from the corridor speaker. 2 voices, both security personnel, both on different floors, both describing the same situation in increasingly urgent terms, and nobody responding from command. One of the voices was Dennis Kowalski, the overnight security supervisor, who I'd worked alongside for 4 years. He was on the ground floor, and he sounded controlled, which meant he had a grip on what was happening, which meant he was someone I needed to reach. "Ground floor," I told Kyle. "We're going to the ground floor." "What about, there are people up here who are still okay, I think, in rooms 317 and, get them and bring them, quickly." He went, and I went to the nurses' station, and I grabbed what I could grab fast. IV supplies, a surgical scissors, 4 syringes loaded with midazolam from the medication cart, because sedation was the only non-physical intervention I could think of that might slow down a turned patient, 2 pairs of gloves, a suture kit, a bag of saline. I grabbed the chart tablet that was sitting on the desk, one of the hospital's documentation tablets, already logged in, because some instinct told me I needed records of what was happening, even if I couldn't articulate why yet. Kyle came back with 2 people. One was an elderly woman named Nora Hatch, 71, admitted 2 days ago for a diabetic ulcer on her left foot and a mild cardiac arrhythmia. She was dressed in her hospital gown and someone's borrowed cardigan, and she was walking slowly, but she was alert, and her eyes were her own, and she looked at me and said, without preamble, "The room next to mine, the man in there, he got up and walked into the wall 3 times and fell down, and then got back up, and I thought I should leave." "Good instinct," I said. "I've been married for 51 years, she said. "I know when something's wrong." The second person Kyle had found was a 9-year-old boy named Tommy Greer. He'd been admitted the previous afternoon for a perforated appendix. Emergency surgery that afternoon, recovering well, due to go home in 2 days. He was wearing a hospital gown and 1 sock, and he had a post-surgical drain still attached to his side that was going to need managing. And he looked at me with the specific expression that children have when they've decided that being scared is less useful than finding out what the adults are planning. "Where's my mom?" he said. His mother, Diane Greer, admitted 30 minutes after Tommy earlier that evening. Not for Tommy, for herself. She'd come in with him, waited through his surgery, and then around 9 p.m., she'd mentioned chest pains that turned out to be nothing cardiac, but we'd kept her for observation on the cardiac floor. 4th floor, a different floor than where we were standing. I said, "She's on 4. We're going to figure out how to get to her, okay? But first we have to go down." He looked at me for a moment, with those 9-year-old eyes that are deciding whether to trust an adult or not. "Okay," he said. That was Tommy. He said okay. He picked up one of Kyle's fire extinguishers with both hands because it was almost as big as he was, and he was determined to carry something useful, and he followed me to the stairwell. The stairwells in Mercy General are one of the things I'd never paid particular attention to in 8 years of working there. Stairwells are just stairwells. They're the thing you take when the elevator is slow. But on that night I noticed every detail of the one we went down. The way the emergency lighting made the white cinder block walls look slightly greenish. The scuff marks on the steps from years of rubber-soled shoes. The smell of fire-retardant paint and old concrete. The way sound carried differently in there. Amplified and directional, in a way that made every footstep feel very loud and very precise. On the 2nd floor landing, we heard something on the other side of the door. We all stopped, all 4 of us. Nora put her hand on the metal railing and gripped it. Kyle held his fire extinguisher tighter. Tommy just went still, which was the right thing to do. The sound on the other side of the door was movement, plural, irregular. The shuffling of more than one person, not walking the way people normally walk. And underneath that same low sound I'd heard from Forsyth, that sustained, breathless vibration. Multiple voices doing it, which made it something other than a sound, and closer to a feeling. "Keep going," I whispered. We went down to the ground floor. Dennis Kowalski was in the main security office off the lobby, which is behind a locked door with a card reader. He'd locked himself in there with the radio and the camera feeds and 2 other people. A woman named Donna Farley, who was the hospital administrator on call, and who I had a complicated professional history with that I don't have time to go into, and a man I didn't recognize, heavy-set, mid-40s, civilian clothes, who turned out to be a pharmaceutical sales representative who'd been having an unauthorized late-night meeting with one of the hospitalists and had ended up locked in the wrong wing when everything went sideways. Dennis opened the door for us and took in our group. Me, Kyle, Nora, Tommy still holding his fire extinguisher. And he said, "How bad is it up there?" "Bad," I said. "2nd and 3rd floor at least. Multiple patients. How many active on your cameras?" He showed me the security monitor. The lobby cameras were working on backup power, and what I saw on those screens was the first time I really, fully let the understanding in, past the compartmentalization that had been keeping me functional. The main ER waiting room, which at 2 a.m. on a normal night has maybe 10 to 15 people in various states of distress, it had more than that. It had people who weren't moving right, and there were regular people, conscious, terrified people, among them, pushing against the walls, pressing against the triage window, trying to get somewhere away from the ones who weren't right. "The main entrance is compromised," Dennis said. "I sealed it 20 minutes ago. There's a secondary entrance through the pharmacy corridor, but..." He checked the camera for that corridor. We both watched it for a moment. "Yeah," I said. "Not that one." Donna Farley, the administrator, said, "We need to initiate the hospital emergency protocol. We need to..." "The phones are down," I said. "The landlines are down, but the cell networks are overloaded," Dennis said, not looking up from the cameras. "I've been trying. Every line is busy or dropping. I've got one text through to 911 dispatch in the last 20 minutes, and all I got back was acknowledged." Donna processed this. She was a capable administrator. I want to be fair about that. She was good at managing systems that existed in their intended form. She was not good at managing the absence of systems, which is what we had. The pharmaceutical rep said, "Can we just wait here? Until someone comes?" I looked at him. "No," I said. Why not? Because the building is full of infected patients and staff, and the building is full of other patients who aren't infected yet, and the building is dark, and we're going to lose this position eventually. I pointed at the camera showing the pharmacy corridor. There are 3 of those things in that corridor, and they don't know we're here yet, but they will, when one of them bumps into that camera housing and makes a sound, and the others turn toward it. We have maybe an hour before this room isn't safe. Silence. The maintenance corridors, Kyle said. He looked at me. You know them, right? You did that thing last winter with the burst pipe. He was right. Last January, a burst pipe on the 3rd floor had required us to reroute certain ward activities through the hospital maintenance network for 2 days, and the facilities manager had walked me through the layout because I needed to know where I could and couldn't take certain equipment. I'd walked most of the hospital's maintenance level. I remembered enough. The maintenance corridor connects to the service elevator shaft, I said, and the service elevator goes to the roof. There's a rooftop access for helicopter evacuations. Dennis looked at me. You think the helicopters are coming? I think the rooftop is defensible, has external communication equipment, and is not full of people who died and came back, I said. I think those are 3 reasons to go there. Tommy, who had been listening to all of this very carefully, raised his hand, like he was in school. Tommy, I said, you don't have to raise your hand. My mom, he said. I know. 4th floor. We'll go through 4 on the way up. He lowered his hand and nodded. 1 sock on, drain bag tucked under his arm, fire extinguisher still in his hands. 9 years old. We need more supplies, I said to Dennis. What do you have in here? What Dennis had was 1 baton, 2 canisters of pepper spray, a trauma kit from the wall-mounted first aid cabinet, a set of master keys for every lockable door in the hospital, and 3 granola bars that had been in his desk drawer. He also had a flashlight with fresh batteries, and a handheld radio with about 4 hours of battery life. I added my grabbed supplies to this. Between the 2 of us, we had enough to manage a moderate trauma for several hours, sedation for potentially 3 or 4 patients if needed, and basic wound care. Okay, I said. We go through the maintenance corridor to the 4th floor stairwell, check room 412 for Tommy's mother, then continue to the roof. Nobody runs. Nobody makes noise that they don't have to make. If we see anything that's not right, we don't engage. We move away from it. We find another route. Does everyone understand? Everyone nodded. The pharmaceutical rep was sweating visibly, but he nodded. What are they? Donna asked. I mean, what is causing? I don't know, I said. I know how it spreads. Don't let one of them bite you. If you're bitten, tell me immediately. That's what I know. I didn't tell her what I suspected would happen if she were bitten, because we needed her functional, and I didn't have enough information yet to be certain. I kept that part to myself. The maintenance corridor entrance was behind a door labeled Facilities, Authorized Personnel Only, at the end of the ground floor east wing. The key Dennis had opened it, and the air that came out of it was different from the rest of the hospital, cooler, drier, smelling like concrete dust, and the specific industrial lubricant they use on the HVAC equipment. The emergency lighting back here was sparser, running on a different circuit, and we were navigating by flashlight for most of it. The corridor itself was narrow, wide enough for 2 people side by side if they didn't have their arms out, and it ran parallel to the east wing up to a point and then branched. I took us left at the first branch, which I was fairly sure went toward the service elevator bay, and I was right. The elevator was still powered on backup, which I hadn't been certain of, and that made the next part easier. We went up to 4. Room 412 was occupied. Diane Greer was in her bed, awake, cardiac monitor showing a normal sinus rhythm, and when we came through that maintenance door into the 4th floor service corridor, and I pushed open the door to her room, her expression went from terrified to confused to something that isn't a word, but is the face people make when relief and a new kind of fear happen at the same time. Tommy, she said. Mom, he said. He'd put down the fire extinguisher somewhere in the corridor. He went to her. I gave them 30 seconds. 30 seconds, because that's what I could give them. Can you walk? I asked her. Yes, What's happening? The nurses all disappeared and the intercom. "Something's wrong with the hospital," I said. "We need to go to the roof. Can you walk?" She was already getting out of the bed, her IV line pulling taut. I unhooked the line from the bag and left the bag. She didn't need the saline urgently, and it was a thing to carry. And she was wearing her own clothes from before, which was lucky, which meant she was easier to move. She took Tommy's hand and looked at me and said, "Okay, I'm okay. Let's go." 4 good words. "I'm okay. Let's go." The 4th floor was quiet. Whatever was happening mostly on the lower floors, or the 4th floor patients had not yet reached whatever threshold triggered the change. We moved through the service corridor fast and took the maintenance elevator to the roof. Roof access at Mercy General is through a mechanical room full of HVAC equipment, condensing units, cooling towers, the kind of machinery that is always on and therefore loud in a specific, constant way that actually helped us, because the sound of all that equipment covered whatever sound we were making. We came out through the roof hatch, and the night hit me like a slap. Cold air, city noise from far below, the smell of something burning from somewhere south of us. There were no helicopters. The rooftop helipad was empty and lit by the edge of the emergency system that powered the rooftop beacon, which was blinking red, white in a steady, automatic rhythm. The city below was wrong. I could see it from the rooftop edge. Patches of the city that were dark, that shouldn't have been dark, and in other patches, lights that were moving in ways that headlights don't move. Emergency lights, maybe, or fires. The two things look similar from height when they're far enough away. There was no signal on any of the phones. Dennis's radio got static on most frequencies, and 2 broken voice transmissions that neither of us could make out clearly enough to decode. We set up in the mechanical room. It was cramped, but it was defensible. One entrance, and I jammed the rooftop hatch behind us with a section of conduit that Dennis found in the corner, which wouldn't hold against sustained pressure, but would buy time. Donna Farley, who I had written off as mostly useless, turned out to have a talent for organization that was actually what we needed right then. She inventoried everything we had, set up the medication supplies in a way I could access quickly, and kept track of who had eaten and how much water was left from the vending machine cans Dennis had grabbed when we went through the lobby. Tommy fell asleep against his mother's shoulder about an hour after we reached the roof, which was the right thing for his body to do post-surgery. I checked his drain and his incision site, and both were okay. Nora's blood glucose was running low, and I gave her the granola bars and half a bag of saline, and started a peripheral IV to keep her stable. Kyle sat against the far wall and didn't say anything for a long time. The pharmaceutical rep, his name was Scott, I'd learned by then, sat next to Kyle and also didn't say anything, but he kept looking at his phone like the situation might change. I sat by the radio and tried frequencies, one after another, methodically, for 2 hours. At 4:47 a.m., I got something. Not a voice, Morse code, which I haven't thought about since a paramedic certification course 8 years ago, where it was listed under additional skills, historical, and I'd spent maybe 40 minutes on it. I stared at the radio speaker like it had said something offensive. Then I grabbed the suture kit packaging and a pen, and I wrote down what I was hearing. It was slow. Whoever was sending it was not an expert. But it was deliberate and patterned, and I got most of it. Rooftop of Parkview, 14 survivors. Requesting evac or contact. Medical needs. Please respond. Parkview was another hospital, about 6 blocks east of us. I didn't have a way to respond in Morse code. I had the handheld radio, and I sent a voice transmission on the same frequency and said who we were and where we were, and that we were alive, and that we had a nurse and some supplies, and could they hear us. And I waited. Nothing came back, but the Morse code stopped, which meant either they'd gone to another frequency, or they'd given up, or they'd heard me and didn't have voice capability, or something had happened. I don't know which. I wrote Parkview, 14 survivors on the back of the suture packet, and put it in my scrub pocket, and I kept it there for a week. The night passed. I will not say it passed quickly, it didn't. It passed the way time passes when you're trapped somewhere uncertain and outside the door of wherever you are. Things are happening that you can hear but not see. and you have a 9-year-old recovering from surgery, and an elderly diabetic woman, and a pharmaceutical rep who is cycling through various stages of shock every 40 minutes. It passed slowly and in pieces, a chunk of almost sleep that lasted maybe 90 minutes before a sound from the stairwell below brought me upright, and then an hour of intense alertness where everything was fine and nothing moved, and then another stretch of muted endurance. At 6:30 a.m., we heard a helicopter. Not heading toward us, going north. We went out onto the rooftop and waved, and Dennis fired the emergency flare from the maintenance room's safety kit, and the helicopter banked. I could see it, a civilian medevac helicopter, orange and white, banking in a slow arc, maybe a half-mile north of us. It banked toward us. It came closer. It circled the building once at maybe 300 feet, and I was waving. Donna was waving. Kyle had taken off his scrub top and was waving that, and the helicopter circled one more time, and then, and this is the part that I still don't understand, because the rooftop was clear of any obstruction, the helipad was right there, the beacon was on, the helicopter tilted and moved off north again, and got smaller, and then was gone. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Scott said, "I think they saw something we can't see from up here." I looked at the side of the building. What you can see from a helicopter, that you can't see from a rooftop, is the building below you. What was on the floors below us, what might have been visible through any windows on those floors, was not something that a pilot seeing it for the first time would want to land near. "Right," I said. We went back inside. At 8:15 a.m., the helicopter came back. I heard it before I could see it, and we went out again, and this time it descended. It was a different pilot, or the pilot had resolved whatever concern had kept them away before, or maybe they'd had a conversation with someone on a radio I couldn't access. The helicopter came down to the helipad, and the rotors didn't stop. It was a park and keep running landing, which in medevac terms means we have time for loading, and then we leave. The medic who jumped out of the side door was a woman about my age, with a cut on her cheek that hadn't been dressed properly, and the specific expression of someone who has been doing this for long enough that they are past the emotional reaction and into pure logistics. She said, "How many?" "7, I said. 1 post-surgical pediatric, 1 elderly cardiac history. We need to prioritize." "I can take 4, she said. "Weight limits. We're overloaded already." I looked back at my group. 7 people. I had 3 seconds to decide. "Nora," I said. "Tommy, Diane, and Dennis. You take Dennis." Dennis started to argue. "You have radio skills, and I need someone on the ground outside who can communicate," I said. "If you go with them, you can relay from wherever they're going. You'll be more useful out there than in here." He looked at me for a moment, then he nodded. He handed me the master keys and the extra radio and his baton. I helped Nora in first, then Tommy and Diane. They went in holding hands, Tommy and his mother, both facing forward. Diane turned back to look at me through the helicopter window as the medic was pulling the door, and I'm not going to describe her expression because I don't have the right words for it, and anyway, it doesn't help anyone to hear it. Dennis got in last. He looked back at me from the door and said something I couldn't hear over the rotors. The door closed. The helicopter went up. And then there were 3 of us on the rooftop. Me, Kyle, and Scott. Scott looked at me and said, "Now what?" The question of the rest of my life, at that point. "Now we get out of this building," I said, "through the front. I want to explain what the hospital looked like in the daylight hours of that first morning, because it was different from the night, and the difference matters. At night, in emergency lighting, in the dark, the hospital had felt like a building in danger. In the gray 8 a.m. light that came through the narrow windows of the maintenance corridors, it looked like a building that had already been lost. We went down through the maintenance elevator, slowly, listening at every floor. We could hear them through the walls. That's the thing about hospitals. The walls are not that thick. Institutions build for function, not for acoustic isolation. Through the drywall and the service corridors, I could hear movement on every floor we passed. That low sound, multiple sources, irregular but constant. On the second floor, through a gap in the maintenance corridor wall, where an access panel had been left ajar, I looked into a section of the east wing. What I saw, 12 patients in the hallway, all of them gone. All of them moving in that slow, directionless way, bumping into walls and each other, turning towards sounds, turning away from sounds, going nowhere, with complete and purposeless conviction. Among them, 2 people in scrubs. I recognized one of them, a respiratory therapist named Alan who'd worked nights for as long as I had. He was wearing the same scrubs as always. He moved the same way all the rest of them moved. I closed the access panel. I didn't let myself feel anything about Alan. That comes later, or it never comes. And either way, you put it somewhere while you're still inside the building. The ground floor was better than the upper floors. By better, I mean fewer turned patients, possibly because the ground floor had more exits, and some had wandered out. The ones that were still in the east wing ground floor corridor were congregated near the lobby, probably because the lobby had the most previous sound and movement activity. We avoided the lobby. The pharmacy corridor had 2 of them. We watched through the maintenance room porthole window for 4 minutes. Both were moving away from us, toward the far end of the corridor. When they were at maximum distance, we went through fast, 40 feet of linoleum in about 7 seconds, and out the pharmacy side exit, which opened onto the hospital's delivery bay, which was external and in the open air and empty. Outside, I stood on the loading dock in the cold morning air, and I looked at the city and I breathed. The city was wrong in the way that I'd suspected from the rooftop. It wasn't ruined. Not yet. Not physically. The buildings were all still standing. The streets were still there. But the patterns were wrong. Traffic signals still cycling through their automated sequences on streets, with no cars moving on them. Lights on in buildings where nothing moved behind the windows. And from somewhere a few blocks west, a sound that I initially thought was a car alarm, and then realized was too continuous and too human to be any machine. "Where do we go?" Kyle asked. I had the master keys and the radio and the tablet, and my bag of supplies, and a baton that I'd never used in a professional context. I had 11 years of emergency medicine. I had no car, no map, no working phone, and no idea what the city looked like at street level, past the 2-block radius I could see from the loading dock. "East," I said, based on the Morse code message. "Parkview Hospital. 6 blocks. We go east, and we keep moving, and we do not stop." That's what we did. I'm not going to make the city walk sound more dramatic than it was, because what it was, mostly, was fast and quiet and frightening in a consistent, low-level way that was almost worse than sharp, sudden danger. The 3 of us moved down an alley running parallel to the main street, using the alley because the main street had abandoned cars scattered across it at intervals, and we couldn't see past the cars, and we needed sight lines. The alley was behind restaurants and small offices, utterances, dumpsters and fire escapes, the kind of urban back channel that's usually populated by restaurant staff and delivery drivers and nobody else. We passed 3 of the turned in those 6 blocks. The first was alone in a doorway. A woman, office clothes, no visible cause, just standing there, in the open doorway of what had been a dry cleaner, not moving, not making the low sound, just standing, still. We passed her by 20 feet, and she didn't react until Kyle's shoe scraped against a piece of broken glass at the wrong angle, and then she turned, and we ran 20 feet. And by the time she'd identified the direction and started moving toward it, we were already around a corner. The second and third were together in the alley, near what had been a coffee shop, both facing away from us. We took a half-block detour through a narrow cut between buildings, barely wide enough to fit through sideways, and came out on the other side without them ever knowing we were there. The turned do not think. I want to be clear about this, because I've heard people since then describe them in ways that suggest intelligence, planning, coordination, intention. That's not what they are. They are bodies running on something that approximates the most basic nervous system function. Detect stimulus, move toward stimulus, respond to stimulus. Sound is the primary trigger. Movement is secondary. Everything above that level is gone. They don't open doors. They don't climb. They don't communicate. They don't remember you. You make a sound, they come. You stop making sound, they mill around for a while and eventually drift. The thing that makes them dangerous is numbers, and the thing that makes numbers dangerous is that one sound attracts one of them, and that one makes sound when it moves, and that sound attracts more of them, and within 60 seconds of one wrong noise in a populated area, you have a problem that goes from one to many, faster than you can outrun. We reached Parkview Hospital at 9:40 a.m. Parkview was smaller than Mercy General, a community hospital, 4 floors. From outside it looked intact. No broken windows on the ground level, no obvious damage. The parking lot had a few cars, but nothing that suggested recent mass arrival. There was a sheet hanging from a 4th-floor window, white, large, with the word "Survivors" spray-painted on it in red paint, capital letters visible from the street. I stood in the parking lot and looked at that sheet, and felt something that I hadn't felt in 7 hours. Something that isn't quite hope and isn't quite relief, but is adjacent to both. The knowledge that there are other people who have made it to morning. I didn't get to feel it for long. From around the side of the Parkview building, a figure came toward us at a fast walk, not running, which turned out to be deliberate. And the figure was a man in a medic uniform, late 30s, with a head wound that had been dressed somewhat professionally on one side, and a radio on his belt, and an expression of intense, focused relief. "You're the nurse from Mercy," he said, which meant he'd been monitoring the frequency, which meant my voice transmission at 5 in the morning had reached someone. "Joanna Kessler," I said. "This is Kyle and Scott." "Frank Hollis," he said. "Paramedic. I've got 14 people inside, and one of them needs a doctor, and I don't have a doctor." "I'm not a doctor," I said. "You're closer than anyone else I've got." That was how I met Frank. He was mid-transmission in the middle of a crisis when we met, which I think set the tone for the entire following month of knowing him. Inside Parkview, the survivors were on the 4th floor, which they'd sealed with a push-heavy fire door and a barricade of filing cabinets. The 4th floor had been in the middle of a renovation when the outbreak started, which meant half the wing was empty of patients, an accident of timing that had kept 14 people alive. Frank's partner, a paramedic named Liz Draper, had organized the 4th floor while Frank had gone to the parking lot to find supplies from the ambulance they'd driven there and never driven away from. 14 people, Frank, Liz, 7 civilians who'd been in the ER waiting room when Parkview's own chaos started, 2 Parkview nurses whose names were Gretchen Moores, and here's where the story gets complicated, because I knew Gretchen, had worked with her years ago before she'd moved to Parkview, and our history was not simple, and a young man named Paul, a nursing student on his 1st-floor rotation. Then there was an off-duty firefighter named Doug, and 2 family members of admitted patients, a young woman and her father who'd been waiting for news about her mother when everything went wrong. The person Frank needed help with was a middle-aged man named Ray Tillinghast, who had caught a piece of flying glass from a window breaking during a ground-floor panic and had taken a laceration on his neck that had been packed and wrapped, but was dangerously close to the external jugular and needed proper closure, or he was going to be in significant trouble. I looked at it. I closed it. The whole thing took 22 minutes, and most of my suture kit, and Ray was white as copy paper the whole time, but he was fine, and the vein was undamaged, and I sat back afterward and let myself shake for about 45 seconds, and then I went to look at the rest of the floor to understand what we had. What we had: a partial hospital floor with working backup power, meaning lights and refrigeration, but no air systems. 2 working bathrooms with water still running. City water pressure was still active, which meant the pumping stations were still on automated systems. A medicine dispensing cabinet on the 4th floor that had been partially emptied when the Parkview staff fled, but still had useful things in it. Antibiotics, pain management, IV supplies, some emergency cardiac medications, insulin, which mattered because Nora wasn't here, but I kept it in mind. A supply closet with 2 weeks of non-perishable food if we were careful. Protein bars, canned goods from the staff break room, a catering delivery that had arrived that morning and never been claimed. So we had 48 boxed lunches intended for a hospital board meeting that had not taken place. Water, food, medicine, a defensible position. We were better off than I'd expected. Gretchen Moores found me in the supply closet while I was inventorying. She looked the same as I remembered her. Efficient, slightly tense in the shoulders. Always slightly tense in the shoulders. But there were things in her face that weren't there the last time I'd seen her. She'd been through what I'd been through, from inside a different hospital, and it had left marks. "Joe," she said, "I heard you were at Mercy." "I was," I said. "How bad was it?" I thought about what to say. I thought about the camera feeds on Dennis's monitor. The second-floor hallway. Alan, the respiratory therapist. "It was very bad," I said. "It started in the morgue." She was quiet for a moment. "Here too," she said. "Here it started in the ER. We had 6 patients come in Tuesday night with what we coded as severe fever and altered mental status. And by Thursday they were—" She stopped. Swallowed. They were gone. And then they weren't gone. And it went from there. "Tuesday," I said. "What day is it today?" "Saturday," she said. "These patients on Tuesday, what were the presenting symptoms before the fever?" She looked at me with a particular expression that registered my question as unusual. Altered behavior, mostly. Confusion, aggression, disorientation. Why? Where were they from? The 6 patients. Do you know? "One of them was from the Riverside neighborhood," she said. "I remember because they lived in the building I grew up in. And I thought—" She stopped again. "Why?" I didn't answer her directly. Instead, I took the hospital documentation tablet out of my bag and pulled up the records I'd grabbed from Mercy General the night before. Among the records, because I'd grabbed the whole pending admissions log in a batch download while I was standing at the nurses' station and moving fast, there were not just last night's patients. There were records going back 3 weeks on the active log. And there it was, what I'd begun to suspect somewhere on that rooftop through the night. Starting 22 days before the outbreak, 22 days before the morgue, before the turned patients, before any of this, Mercy General's ER had received a series of patients with a specific presentation: severe fever, confusion, aggression, biting behavior noted in at least 3 charts, and an address cluster in the Riverside neighborhood of the city, which sits 2 miles east of the hospital and is built around the city's primary water treatment plant. I'd seen these patients in the log and not thought anything about them, because they were not my patients. They were medical patients, not trauma cases, handled by the internal medicine team and not by the ER nursing staff on a normal night. The charts were brief. Most of them had been discharged or transferred within 48 hours. But one of the charts had a note appended to it. A consultation note from an infectious disease physician named Dr. Timothy Okafor, who had seen 3 of the patients, noted the cluster, requested further labs, and then, according to the system log, had his follow-up documentation access suspended by someone in the hospital's administrative system before the results were uploaded. That's not something that happens by accident. Documentation access doesn't get suspended by accident. It's a manual override in the hospital records system, which requires someone with administrative-level credentials to perform. I sat with that information in the supply closet for about 4 minutes without moving. Then I went and found Gretchen and I said, "Did Parkview have unusual fever patients in the past 3 weeks? Before Tuesday? Before the 6 in the ER?" She thought about it. "We had a cluster about 2.5 weeks ago. I remember because Dr. Sullivan thought it might be a flu variant and wanted to precautionary isolate, but administration said it was seasonal and not to overreact." "Did the patients from that cluster recover?" "They were discharged. I assumed they recovered." A pause. "Joe, what are you saying?" "I'm saying someone knew this was coming," I said. "Not exactly, maybe not specifically, but someone had the information that this was building, and they chose not to act on it, or they were stopped from acting on it." Gretchen looked at the tablet in my hands for a long time. "Who?" she said. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I want to find out. That was day 1, or day 2, depending on how you count. I count from when I was finishing paperwork, and the world still made sense, which makes the morning at Parkview day 2. We spent 2 days at Parkview. On the first day, we stabilized everyone medically, and established routines. Watches, food rationing, a decontamination process for going in and out of the floor. On the second day, I went through more of the records, and Kyle and Frank went on 2 supply runs to nearby buildings and came back with everything they could carry. On the second day, also, the Parkview 4th floor became untenable. The Parkview turned. The hospital's own patients, however many had gone through the change since Tuesday, were working their way up the building the way water works its way through a building, not intelligently, not purposefully, but by accumulation. They couldn't take the stairs with any coordination, but they could follow sound up the stairwells, and over 48 hours of a building full of people moving and talking and coughing, there were enough of them on 3 that the 3rd floor was no longer quiet, which meant the 3rd floor created noise, which meant by the second night we could hear through the fire door. Frank had been thinking about this. Frank was the kind of person who plans ahead in a concrete, mechanical way. He thought about problems the way a mechanic thinks about an engine, in terms of what part is failing and what the next most likely failure point is. He'd been outside twice, and he'd scouted the neighborhood in a radius of 3 blocks. "There's a fire station 4 blocks north," he said. "Station 7. I drove past it a dozen times on calls. It's built like a box. The apparatus bay doors are roll-downs, and if the apparatus is still inside, we can use the vehicles." "Staffed?" I asked. "Unknown. When I went past the first time, the lights were on. Second time, less so. I think whoever was there went out to respond to calls at some point, and either didn't come back or did come back and decided to leave." "Any of them visible from the outside?" "No, which could mean they're inside and quiet, or it could mean they're gone." "It's 4 blocks, I said. "Through what?" "The north route has 2 cross streets that are clear, based on what I could see. The east block is problematic. There was a vehicle accident at the intersection, cars piled up, and it was drawing attention from the turned." "We go north then," I said, "around the blocked intersection." Liz said, "We move 17 people 4 blocks through a city with—" "We're not moving everyone at once," Frank said. "We go in 2 groups, 15 minutes apart, scouts first, then the main group." It took us most of the next morning to move everyone, and it wasn't clean, and I'm not going to pretend it was clean, but it worked. We lost one person, Scott, the pharmaceutical rep, who stumbled getting out of the parking lot and went down on his knee, and the sound of his fall on the asphalt was enough to bring 2 turned from around a blind corner faster than either Frank or I could get back to him. Scott made a choice. He told us to go. He wasn't resigned or heroic about it, he just made a calculation. The 2 turned were between him and us and moving toward him, not us. And he said go, and we went. I will carry that for a very long time. But the rest of us reached Station 7. The station was not empty. It had 1 person in it, a man named Brendan Calloway, 48, a fire captain who had responded to calls on the first night and returned to find his crew not with him. They'd been dispatched separately, and he didn't know where they went, and he'd never been able to find out. He'd been alone in the station for 2 days. He'd locked the apparatus bay and stayed in the back office and eaten the station's emergency rations and listened to the radio. And when we came to the bay door and knocked in the pattern Frank had established with him on the radio the previous evening, the bay door rolled up and Brendan was standing there in full turnout gear, looking at our group of now 16 people, with an expression that took about 5 seconds to settle from controlled wariness into something that might have been described as relief, if Brendan Calloway were the kind of person to show it openly, which he wasn't. "Nurse," he said, looking at me. "RN," I said. 11 years ER, Mercy General. He nodded, like this was exactly what he'd expected. "You look like you could use coffee." "I look like I could use a week of sleep," I said. "Coffee first." The fire station became home. That's the right word for it, even though home is not a word I use loosely, and nothing about a fire station is designed for domestic comfort. But it was ours. We were the people in it. We made it work. Station 7 was a standard 3-bay apparatus station built in the 1980s, updated twice since, with a crew quarters upstairs that included 8 bunks, a kitchen, a common room, 2 bathrooms with showers, and an office. The apparatus bay downstairs held 2 fire trucks, engine 7 and ladder 7, and an empty bay where the ambulance had been until Brendan's crew took it on the first night and didn't bring it back. Both trucks had full tanks. The station had a generator that ran on diesel, and the station's fuel storage included a diesel reserve tank that Brendan estimated at about 60% full, which at controlled generator use could give us weeks. Brendan also had something I hadn't expected, a ham radio set up in the office, handheld and desk-mounted, with backup battery power. The ham radio was how the station had been used before we got there, actually. Not by Brendan, by someone else. I found this out on our 3rd day in the station, when I went into the office to use the desk radio and found a locked drawer on the desk. I asked Brendan about it. He looked at it for a moment and said he'd found the drawer locked when he arrived and hadn't thought to force it open because he had other problems. The master keys from Mercy General included a variety of lock types, and one of them fit the drawer. Inside was a spiral notebook, college-ruled, 2/3 full of handwriting, and a set of printed maps of the city with certain areas highlighted in yellow marker, and a list of frequencies. The handwriting was small and neat and organized like notes rather than a journal. Dated entries, brief, factual. The earliest entry in the notebook was dated 28 days ago. The last entry was 3 days before the outbreak. I read the whole notebook in one sitting. It took me about 45 minutes. Whoever wrote it, no name, no identifying information in any of the entries, had been monitoring radio transmissions and public health reports, and, it seemed, some kind of internal communication that I couldn't fully identify from the context, but that appeared to be from inside either the city's public health department or a related institution. The notebook tracked the Riverside cluster, the same cluster I'd found in Mercy General's records. It tracked the cluster in detail, with numbers, cases by date, address by address, symptom progression, and at a certain point, a notation that read, "Contamination vector confirmed. Water distribution. See attached." There was no attached. Whatever had been attached to that page was gone. The final entry, 3 days before the outbreak, said, "Moving. Not safe to stay. Monitor FRECA, 47.2 for continuation." Whoever had been sitting in this office, in this station, tracking the beginning of what we were now living in the middle of, they'd known. They'd known 3 days before it went public. They'd known it was in the water, and then they'd left and taken the evidence with them and gone somewhere, and I didn't know where, and I didn't know who they were. I brought the notebook to Brendan and showed him. He read it twice, slowly. "Someone was here before me," he said. "Using the station as a monitoring point," I said. "They had access to internal communications that weren't public. Public health? Maybe. Or someone inside the water authority." Brendan turned to the maps with the highlighted areas. The highlights were concentrated around the Riverside neighborhood and the water treatment facility specifically. Around the treatment plant, whoever had done this highlighting had drawn a circle in red pen, and inside the circle, a notation, Ground Zero. "The water," I said. "It started with the water." Brendan nodded slowly. "Half the city gets its water from the Riverside plant," he said. He knew the city the way someone who's driven its streets for 20 years knows it, in the specific, practical knowledge of infrastructure. The other half from the Highland facility, which is why some areas of the city are worse than others, I said. I was thinking of the drive from the hospital, the way some blocks had been heavy with turned and other blocks had been strangely quiet. The areas served by the Highland plant would have had less exposure, Brendan said, or slower exposure, or different exposure, depending on what was in the water and how much. I walked through an area near the treatment plant that was completely empty, I said. No turned, no people, nothing, like the air itself had cleared it. Brendan looked at me. "You think the source area is somehow—" "I don't know. I'm a nurse, not a virologist. I have an observation, and it doesn't fit a pattern I understand yet." I looked at the notebook, but someone else understood it, or was beginning to. We set the frequency 47.2 on the desk radio and left it scanning. On the second night, it picked up something, not the notebook writer, but a repeating automated broadcast. A recorded voice, measured and calm, giving a location. The Eastern Medical Research Facility at Whitmore University, 11 miles north of the city. The broadcast said, "Researchers present. Limited survivor capacity. Radio contact only. If you are a medical professional, please advise your location." 11 miles. Medical researchers. Possible information about the outbreak. I added that to the notebook page in my pocket with the Morse code message. I want to tell you about Robbie now, because Robbie matters. Robbie Hartley arrived at Station 7 on day 4. He was 26, slight, with the kind of perpetually apologetic expression that some people have naturally, and which gets very complicated in a crisis, because people confuse it with guilt. He'd walked from somewhere east of the station, and he was carrying a backpack with some food and a bedroll, and he knocked on the bay door in the pattern that we'd established, which meant he'd heard us on a radio, and when the door opened a crack to assess him, he showed his arms. Both of them. Palms up, sleeves rolled. Because that's what you did by then. You showed your arms to prove you weren't hiding a bite. It was an unofficial rule that we'd implemented without ever formally discussing it. The same way groups under pressure develop rules that nobody articulates but everyone follows. Robbie had a bite on his left forearm. It was 3 days old, he said. He'd been bitten by a turned-in an apartment building while trying to get supplies from a neighbor's unit, and he'd cleaned it with alcohol and wrapped it and waited. And here he was on day 3, not turned. Doug, the off-duty firefighter, said no. Immediately, without ambiguity. Frank said, "Let's hear the situation before we decide." I said, "Let me look at it." I looked at it. The wound was genuinely 3 days old. The tissue response was consistent with that timeline. The bruising at the wound margins, the state of the edges. It had been cleaned well, better than most people would manage in a crisis. There was no sign of the rapid onset fever that I'd observed in Carl in the morgue, or in Tracy in room 218. If the bite had been transmitted, if whatever was in the bite that turned Carl had also been in this one, then by day 3, Robbie should be either turned or dead from the transition. He was neither. He was standing in front of me with his sleeve rolled up and looking at me with that apologetic face, waiting. "I need to draw blood," I said to him. "Is that okay?" "Whatever you need," he said. I drew 2 vials. I labeled them with the date and RH, day 3, post-bite, unaffected, and put them in the station refrigerator, which Brendan was running on the generator for food storage. I had no idea what I'd do with the blood samples in a practical sense. I'm a nurse. I can collect blood. I can't analyze it. But something told me that the information in those vials was potentially the most important thing in Station 7. Robbie stayed. Doug argued about it for 2 days and then stopped arguing, which is not the same as agreeing but is close enough for practical purposes. On day 5, he was still fine. On day 7, still fine. On day 9, the wound on his arm had healed to the point where it just looked like any other scar. I started watching Robbie Hartley the way you watch something that shouldn't exist and does anyway. He was quiet, useful in specific ways. He'd worked in warehouse logistics, and he was good at organization and inventory, the kind of unglamorous competence that most people don't notice until it's absent. He cooked for the group 3 nights in a row without being asked, which is also the kind of thing that sustains a community without drawing attention. He didn't talk about what it had been like to be bitten. I didn't push it. On day 8, I sat down with Gretchen in the kitchen after everyone else was asleep, and I told her what I'd found in the hospital records and the notebook. All of it. The cluster, the water treatment facility, the documentation suspension, Dr. Okafor's access being removed. She was quiet for a long time. She was turning her coffee mug around in her hands, not drinking from it, just rotating it slowly, the way you do when your hands need something to do while your brain is working. "My colleague," she said finally, "at Parkview, a resident named Aaron Sims who was working the early fever cases with me 3 weeks ago. He called in sick on the Thursday before everything started. He never came back." She kept rotating the mug. "I assumed he'd caught what the patients had. I assumed he'd..." She stopped. "Did he live in Riverside?" I asked. She looked up. "Yes." "Did he drink tap water?" A long pause. Joe. He was a first-year resident. He lived in a studio apartment, and he worked 90-hour weeks. Of course he drank tap water. Or, I said carefully, he was one of the early cases that passed through the hospital before anyone understood what was happening, and before anyone knew the outbreak was coming. Gretchen set the mug down. Then I don't know, I said. I genuinely don't know, and I didn't. There was a slender possibility, a possibility I kept in the same mental pocket as Robbie's blood samples, that not everyone who went through an early exposure was the same. But I wasn't going to build on that possibility yet, not without more. That night, Brendan picked up a voice transmission on frequency 47.2. It was clear and calm and professional. A woman's voice, middle-aged, with the specific cadence of someone trained to transmit on radio, measured and precise. She gave a location, not Whitmore University. The Mercy Cross Hospital on the west side of the city, 17 miles from our station. If you are medical personnel, or if you have access to blood samples from unaffected bite survivors, the voice said, we are requesting contact. We have research capacity. We have uninfected survivors. We have information about the outbreak source. Please respond on this frequency. The three of us, me, Brendan, Frank, looked at each other around the desk radio. Medical personnel, Frank said. That's you. Blood samples from unaffected bite survivors, Brendan said, looking at me. You've got those. I sat very still for a moment. She said, information about the outbreak source, I said. I already have information about the outbreak source. I've had it for 6 days. You have pieces, Frank said. They might have the whole thing. Or they might have a fraction of what I have, and they're using a professional broadcast to attract resources. I looked at the radio. Mercy Cross is 17 miles. Through the city. Not necessarily through the city, Brendan said. He pulled out a map, a real paper map, from the station's vehicle maps folder. There's a river road. Stays mostly residential. Avoids the dense commercial zones where the turn concentration would be highest. I studied the map. We'd need vehicles that can handle blockages. Engine 7 can handle blockages, Brendan said, with the particular flat certainty of someone who has pushed a fire truck through various obstacles for 20 years. We can't take everyone, I said. No, 4 of us max. You, me, Frank, one other. I thought about who the one other should be. Kyle was useful, but he was 22, and he'd been through a lot, and I wasn't sure he was ready for 17 miles of city. Liz was Frank's partner, and would want to come, but Liz was better at the station. She'd been running the medical assessments for new arrivals, and she had a system. Doug had the physical skills, but he and I had a persistent tension about Robbie that I didn't want in a truck cab for several hours. Robbie, I said. Frank looked at me. Robbie knows logistics, I said. He's calm under pressure. And if Mercy Cross has researchers who are interested in unaffected survivors, you want to bring him to them, Frank said. Not just his blood. The blood is already refrigerated and will be fine, but a living subject who is day 12 post-bite with no symptoms is more information than 2 vials, I said. Frank thought about it, then he nodded once. I told Robbie that night. He listened to everything I said. The radio transmission, the plan, the fact that I was going to bring him to people who might want to look at him like a specimen. And when I finished, he said, yeah, okay. I waited for more. He looked at me. I want to help, he said. I don't know why I'm not, why it didn't, but I want to help if I can. You understand that we don't know what's at Mercy Cross, I said. We don't know who's transmitting or what capacity they actually have. We don't know if it's safe. Is anywhere safe? He said. Point taken, I said. We left at 5 the next morning. The pre-dawn hours were the quietest. The turned are not nocturnal. They don't have a circadian cycle. They don't sleep. They don't functionally differ between day and night. But they cluster over time toward areas of previous sound and activity, which means streets where things happened draw more of them, and commercial areas and main roads collected them through the daylight hours. Early morning, before whatever sounds had accumulated through the night drew more, the residential streets had their best windows. Engine 7 is not a subtle vehicle. It's 11 feet tall and weighs somewhere over 40,000 pounds, and it does not move quietly. But it's also nearly impervious to anything at street level, which mattered. We cleared 2 vehicle blockages in the first 4 miles, a cluster of 3 cars diagonally across an intersection, and a garbage truck that had come to rest across a residential driveway and extended into the road. The fire truck pushed through both without significant effort. Brendan drove. Frank was in the passenger seat with the radio. I was in the jump seat behind with the medical bag, and Robbie was beside me. The turn we encountered, we saw 46 in 17 miles. That sounds like a lot. It's actually not. 17 miles is a long distance, and 46 distributed across it is sparse by the standards of what we'd seen closer to the hospitals. Most were alone or in small pairs. Most were in areas near the city center, which we skirted on the river road. The residential neighborhoods we drove through had a few at intersections, 2 in the middle of a residential block for reasons unclear, but not the density I'd feared. At mile 9, we passed through a neighborhood that made all 4 of us go quiet. I want to describe this carefully because I keep coming back to it, and I want to get it right. The neighborhood was called Birchwood. I knew it by name because I'd driven through it on a Saturday afternoon once, years ago, looking for an estate sale that turned out to be on the wrong block, and it sat directly adjacent to the Riverside water treatment plant. The plant itself was visible from the road, chain-link fence, and industrial structures. Silent now, no visible activity. Birchwood was empty in a way that was qualitatively different from the emptiness of the rest of the city. The rest of the city was empty in the way a place is empty when people have left, things knocked over, doors open, cars abandoned mid-maneuver, the evidence of rapid, panic departure everywhere. Birchwood was empty in the way a place is empty when nothing happened there at all. Cars in driveways, lights on in houses, interior lights, not emergency lighting, which meant those houses still had power. Flowers in window boxes that were in various stages of dying, but hadn't been there long enough to die all the way. The everyday objects of an intact neighborhood with no people. No turned either, not one. Brendan slowed without me asking him to. We all looked. "The plant is right there," Frank said quietly. "If the contamination went out through the water distribution and Birchwood is the first neighborhood in the distribution system after the plant," I said slowly, "then Birchwood would have the highest concentration of whatever was in the water, earlier and more heavily than anywhere else." "And?" Brendan said, "And everyone in Birchwood either turned first, before anyone knew what was happening, turned, and then moved through the city following sound and activity, leaving Birchwood empty, or I stopped. "Or they didn't turn," Robbie said. We all looked at him. "Like me," he said. He was looking out the window at the empty houses. "What if some people just don't? What if some people were exposed early enough, or in a certain amount, and didn't turn, and then they left? Because the turned that came from somewhere else drove them out." Silence in the cab. "I don't know if that's what happened," I said. "I genuinely don't know. But it's possible," he said. "It's possible," I said. We drove on. Mercy Cross Hospital came into view at mile 17, which we reached at 7:40 in the morning. It was a larger facility than Parkview, 6 floors, and the exterior was more obviously organized than I'd expected. The parking lot had been cleared, not of cars but of blockages, with a path made through the abandoned vehicles that was wide enough for emergency vehicles. The perimeter had been reinforced with what looked like temporary fencing, chain-link panels on metal stakes, and there were people on the roof. Visible people, moving with purpose. 2 of them, with what I was fairly sure were handheld radios. One of the roof people saw Engine 7 and spoke into a radio, and there was movement below. And by the time Brendan had driven us to the cleared path in the parking lot, there were 3 people at what had been the emergency vehicle entrance, which now had a reinforced gate made from 2 ambulance stretchers and several lengths of chain. I know that sounds improvised. It was. It was also effective. One of the 3 people at the gate was a woman in her 50s in lab attire, not scrubs, actual lab coat over civilian clothes, who looked at our truck with the expression of someone expecting exactly this and managing her own relief very carefully. She had silver hair cut practically short, and a way of standing that suggested long acquaintance with institutional authority. "You called us," I said through the truck window. "I called for medical personnel and unaffected subjects," she said. "You appear to be both." "I'm Joanna Kessler, RN. This is Frank Hollis, Brendan Calloway, and Robbie Hartley." She looked at Robbie for a moment in a specific way that I noticed. "Dr. Vivian Marsh," she said. "I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist. I was at a conference here when the outbreak started. I've been here since." She gestured toward the gate. "Come in." The inside of Mercy Cross was running. That's the word. Running, with a degree of organization and controlled activity that stood in stark contrast to every other building we'd been inside in the past 12 days. Power was on. Full power, not just backup, because they had 3 generators and a fuel contract with a supplier on the hospital campus. There were approximately 60 survivors inside, of whom 11 were medical personnel of various specialties. There was a functional clinic on the 2nd floor. There was food, organized and rationed. There was a security rotation staffed by a combination of 2 off-duty police officers and a former Army medic and several volunteers. And there was a laboratory. The laboratory was small, a converted supply room on the 3rd floor, with equipment that Dr. Marsh and 2 of the hospital's lab technicians had assembled from whatever the hospital's pathology department had available. It was not equipped for the kind of molecular biology work that would be needed to fully characterize whatever was in the water. But it was more than anyone else I'd been with had. Dr. Marsh brought me to the lab and showed me what she had. She was careful and clear about the limits. "I want you to understand that we are working far outside the parameters of normal pathology here," she said, with the specificity of someone who considers understatement a professional obligation. "We have microscopy. We have basic culture capacity. We have some immunoassay tools that are limited by the reagents we have remaining. We can characterize. We cannot cure." "What have you characterized?" I asked. She showed me slides. Samples taken from turned patients they'd been able to isolate and examine. I'm not going to go into the details of how they managed that, because it doesn't help you to know, and it was not pleasant work. What the microscopy showed was something that Marsh described as a modified prion-like agent with unusual replication characteristics, which is a phrase that means very little without the specific biological context. But the short version of what she told me was this: whatever was in the water had a long initial incubation period of apparent dormancy, potentially weeks, followed by a rapid onset progression once a secondary trigger occurred. She believed, based on the timeline of the outbreak and the Riverside cluster data, that the secondary trigger was a separate chemical compound in the water that interacted with the primary agent. 2 compounds, I said, not 1. We believe so. The primary agent alone appears to be tolerated, perhaps indefinitely in some individuals. It's the secondary compound that activates the cascade. She looked at Robbie, who had come into the lab with me and was standing quietly near the door. "May I ask how long ago you were bitten?" 12 days, Robbie said. "And you've had no symptoms? No fever, no cognitive disruption, nothing," he said. "I feel the same." She picked up a pen and a notepad and wrote something down. "In the Riverside neighborhood," she said, without looking up, "the initial exposure began approximately 5 weeks ago. Anyone who consumed Riverside water in those 5 weeks received the primary agent. But the secondary compound, the activating compound, entered the distribution system approximately 3 weeks ago. Anyone who had already been exposed to the primary agent and then consumed the secondary compound underwent rapid progression." She looked at Robbie. "My hypothesis is that individuals who consumed only the primary agent and were then bitten by a turned, not bitten by the agent in the water, but bitten by someone who had already turned, received a form of the primary agent that had been, for lack of a better term, altered by the host. And in some individuals, perhaps due to immune response, this altered form does not interact with the secondary compound in the same way." I processed this. "You're saying the bite from a turned person is not the same vector as the original water contamination?" "It behaves differently in some individuals, yes. The turned are transmitting something. They're clearly infectious through bite. But what they're transmitting is not the original compound as it existed in the water. It's been through at least one host's biological process. In some people, the body can contain it. She set down the pen. We need your blood samples, Miss Kessler. And we need to examine Mr. Hartley. And we need to know everything you know about the Riverside cluster. The Riverside cluster, I said. What do you know about it? We know it was the source. We believe the water treatment plant was either the site of an accidental contamination, or, she paused. There is evidence that the initial compound was not naturally occurring. The room was very quiet. Not naturally occurring, I said. We cannot determine from the available evidence whether the introduction was deliberate or whether it was an industrial accident involving some kind of modified biological compound that was being processed or stored at the treatment facility, she said. I want to be clear that we do not know this. We have only the compound's characteristics and the evidence that it does not match any known naturally occurring prion variant in our literature. I thought about the notebook in the fire station, the circled map, ground zero. Someone knew it was coming, I said. Dr. Marsh looked at me steadily. Yes, she said. We believe so. Who? We don't know. I looked at her for a moment. You have 60 survivors here, I said. You have a working lab. You have power. You've been here 12 days. Have you made any attempt to find out? A small pause. We've been focused on the research. I understand that, I said, and I think the research is essential. But if someone introduced this compound deliberately, or if someone failed to prevent an accidental introduction that they knew about, that's information that affects every decision we make about where to go next, about whether there are other contamination sites, about whether... I stopped myself. I have records from Mercy General showing a documentation suppression on the 22nd. Someone in hospital administration blocked an infectious disease physician's access to patient records while he was documenting the cluster. 22nd, Marsh said. She looked at one of her lab technicians, a young man named Kevin who'd been quiet in the corner the whole time, and something passed between them. A recognition. What? I said. We received a phone call on the 20th, Marsh said slowly, before the outbreak. Before the outbreak was public, before it was anything. A call to this hospital's infectious disease department, from an anonymous caller who said there was a contamination event in the Riverside distribution network and that we should monitor for unusual fever presentations. She set her pen down. Our ID chief reported it to administration and was told it was likely a prank. He filed a note. He filed a note that was then not acted on, I said. Correct. Administration. Correct. We sat with that for a moment. The morning light through the laboratory window was ordinary and clear, and the whole situation was insane. The call on the 20th, I said, 2 days before the documentation was suppressed at Mercy General, and the notebook in the fire station stopped 3 days before the outbreak. I was thinking out loud at this point. Someone was tracking it. Someone outside the hospital systems, and someone inside the hospital system was actively working to prevent documentation. I looked at Marsh. The same someone, or different? We don't know, she said again. What do you know? She was quiet for a moment. Then she walked to a cabinet on the far wall and opened it and took out a folder. A physical folder, actual paper, which in the context of everything was its own kind of shock. She put it on the table in front of me. Read it, she said. I read it. It took 30 minutes. By the end of it, my hands were not shaking. I want to be clear about that, because I've seen the shaking hands version of this moment in movies, and that's not what happened. What happened is that I became very still. That's what my body does with large information. It gets very still. What the folder contained was a series of printed communications between the city's public health department and a private water treatment services contractor that had been managing the Riverside plant for the past 2 years. The communications were dense and technical, and I won't quote them because they deserve full context to be understood. But the short version is this. The contractor had been conducting a pilot program for a novel disinfection compound, a modified chloramine compound, that the city had approved through an expedited review process 18 months ago. The compound was proprietary to the contractor. The safety data was incomplete, submitted to the city with multiple redactions, and approximately 6 weeks ago, the contractor's quarterly quality report showed an anomalous reading in the distribution network that the contractor had classified internally as within acceptable deviation and had not reported to the city. The contractor knew 6 weeks ago, I said. We believe they knew something, Marsh said. Whether they knew exactly what that anomalous reading meant. Where is the contractor now? I asked. The contracting company's headquarters are in Atlanta. Beyond that, we have no information. I closed the folder. I looked at it for a moment without seeing it. This doesn't help us immediately, I said. No, Marsh agreed, but it will help the people who come after us. I looked up at her. You believe people are coming after us. I believe this will end, she said. I believe the compound in the water is time-limited, that without continued introduction, it will dilute and denature. And I believe that in areas served by uncontaminated water distribution, the crisis is either absent or significantly slower. I believe the infection from the turned, as I've described, is not universally lethal, and that Robbie Hartley is not unique. I believe, she stopped, adjusted something in her expression. I believe we have work to do before any of that belief is useful. The blood samples, I said. Yes. I gave her the blood samples I'd collected from Robbie at the fire station. She had better refrigeration, and she handled them with the careful precision of someone who understood exactly what they represented. She told me she'd have preliminary microscopy results within 24 hours, and she asked if we could stay. I went to find Frank and Brendan. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with a man in an isolation room on Mercy Cross's 3rd floor, because it's the strangest thing that happened in those weeks, and I still haven't fully decided what to make of it. Mercy Cross had 2 isolation rooms that they were using for a different purpose than their design. They were keeping people in them rather than keeping contamination in. Not turned patients, not infected patients. People who had been bitten and were being observed before the group decided whether to trust them. It's a brutal thing to describe simply, but that was the reality. They had a biometric test, temperature, and a simple cognitive assessment that they ran every 6 hours on anyone who arrived with a bite, and until you passed a certain number of tests over a certain number of hours, you were in isolation. The isolation rooms are small, with a window on the wall facing the corridor. Safety glass, not breakable from the inside, with a slot for passing items through. I was walking past on my way back from the lab, and there was a man in one of the rooms who looked up when I passed and said, through the door, "Are you the nurse from Mercy General?" I stopped. "I am," I said. "Joanna Kessler," he said. I looked at him through the glass. Middle-aged, maybe late 40s, with the look of someone who has been in a small room for longer than is comfortable. Well-nourished, meaning he'd had food. Calm, which was either good or concerning, depending on what it came from. "You know my name," I said. "I heard someone say it in the corridor," he said. "I'm sorry. My name is Gary Ostrowski. I was an environmental engineer at the Riverside Treatment Plant." I stopped moving. I stood in the corridor and looked at him through the window. "Sit down," I said. "Please." He sat on the edge of the cot. "How long have you been in this room?" I asked. 8 days, he said. I arrived with a bite on my shoulder. I'm fine. I've been fine since day 1, but they keep the protocol, and I understand it." He paused. "I was in Birchwood. I live in Birchwood." Birchwood, the silent neighborhood, the neighborhood by the plant. "You were exposed early," I said. "Very early," he said. I started to feel strange about 3 weeks before everything collapsed. I didn't know what it was. I thought I was getting a cold. Then I felt, I'm going to use a word that sounds strange. I felt normal again. Better than normal. For about a week I felt like nothing was wrong. And then the outbreak started and I stayed in my house, and I watched the neighborhood, and then I walked north and eventually got here. He looked at me steadily. "I've been trying to tell someone about the plant, about what happened there, but they keep me in this room." "Tell me," I said. He told me. I'm going to summarize because the full account took an hour and I can't reproduce all of it. But what Gary Ostrowski told me through an isolation room window in the third floor of Mercy Cross Hospital was this. He was not the only one at the plant who knew about the anomalous readings 6 weeks ago. He knew. His supervisor knew. The contractor's on-site representative knew. His supervisor had wanted to report it immediately to the city. The contractor's representative had, not threatened exactly, but made clear that the remediation costs and regulatory liability from a full disclosure would be substantial, and had presented it as an internal monitoring issue that they would manage without external notification. His supervisor had been deciding what to do about it when the outbreak accelerated. His supervisor's name was Thomas Bellard. Thomas Bellard, Gary said, had not gone to his house and stayed there when it started. He'd gone to the plant. He'd told Gary in a phone call 2 days into the outbreak that he was going to the plant because there might be something there that could help. Something in the compound documentation that the contractor had never fully disclosed. He went to the plant, Gary said. He's been there, or I think he's been there. I lost contact after the second day. I thought about the notebook in the fire station. The notebook that stopped 3 days before the outbreak and said, "Moving, not safe to stay." I thought about frequency 47.2 and the neat handwriting and the highlighted maps with ground zero circled in red. What did Thomas Bellard look like? I asked. Gary described him. Mid-50s, stocky, gray beard, wore the same blue work jacket every day for 10 years. Did he have a ham radio? I said. Gary blinked. He had everything. He was the kind of person who prepared for things, always thought about backup systems. I stood very still in the corridor for a long moment. Gary, I said, I'm going to get you out of this room today. Dr. Marsh was skeptical until I explained. Then she did the expedited version of the biometric protocol. 3 tests in 3 hours, all passed, cognitive function clearly intact, and Gary Ostrowski walked out of the isolation room on day 8 of his captivity, smelling like old recycled air and looking like someone who has been waiting a long time to be heard. I sat him down with Dr. Marsh and the folders she'd shown me, and his own knowledge of the plant's operations, and the notebook from the fire station, which I'd described in detail though I didn't have it with me, and the 3 of us had a conversation that lasted most of the afternoon. What we arrived at, by the end of it, was not a solution. Let me be clear about that. We were not scientists in a fully equipped lab, and we were not operating in a world with functioning institutions. We couldn't fix the water supply. We couldn't produce a treatment. We couldn't reverse what had happened to hundreds of thousands of people in this city. What we could establish was a picture of what had happened that was more complete than any single one of us had, and why it had happened, and what the limits of the spread might be, and where populations might exist that were less exposed or differently exposed. The compound, as Gary understood it from his technical knowledge, was unstable above certain concentrations. The outbreak had not spread evenly because the water pressure and distribution patterns were uneven across the city. The Highland plant served a portion of the city that was fully unexposed. Areas that used filtered wells rather than city water were fully unexposed. Rural areas outside the distribution network were, as far as anyone could determine, entirely unaffected. There are places outside the city that are fine, Gary said. Completely fine. The agents are in the water system. Outside the water system, they don't exist. Marsh nodded slowly. The infection from the turned is a secondary spread, she said. It's what extended the outbreak beyond the water distribution area. But it's also, as I discussed earlier, not universally lethal. The original compound in the water was far more reliably progressive than the bite vector. If the bite were as reliable a transmission mechanism as the water was, more of us would be turned, I said. Many more, she said. The bite infection appears to have a failure rate, a significant one. I looked at Gary. You were exposed through the water, early and in high concentration, from what you've described. You've been bitten since, and you're fine. I've been fine since before the outbreak, he said. Like I said, I felt strange and then I felt better. You were exposed to the primary compound, Marsh said, before the secondary compound entered the system, Your body processed the primary compound and developed something, some response, and the bite didn't override it. Like an accidental vaccination, I said. She looked at me. That is not a word I'm going to use carelessly. I know, I said. But the concept. A long pause. The concept, she said carefully, is a direction for research. That night, at Mercy Cross, Frank found me sitting on the fire escape outside the third-floor window, which is where I'd been for about 40 minutes looking at the city. The city at night was quieter than the city during the day. I don't know if it would have been possible to love a city from a fire escape in the middle of a catastrophe, but I found out that night that it is. The lights that were still on, scattered and irregular across the dark grid of the streets, look different from how they look when everything is working and the full city is illuminated. They looked like they meant more. Frank sat down next to me and didn't say anything for a while, which is one of the things I appreciated about him. Brendan wants to go back tomorrow, he said eventually. I know, I said. The group at Station 7 can't wait more than another day or two without more food. You don't want to go back, he said. It wasn't a question. I want to go back, I said. I need to be at Station 7. That's my group. I looked at the lights. I also feel like I've just sat down at a table where work is happening that matters, and going back means leaving. You could stay, he said. Liz can run the medical assessments at 7. She can, I said. She's good. But I'm the nurse and 7 is my station, and if something happens, I stopped. You can't be everywhere, Frank said. I know. You can't be the only thing between everything bad and everyone who's survived. I know, I said. I know that. But I've never been very good at knowing it. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What do you need from here before you go? The preliminary microscopy results on Robbie's samples. Whatever Marsh can put in writing about the water compound and the distribution pattern. And Gary, I added. Gary comes back with us. He'll want to, Frank said. He's been sitting in that room for 8 days. He'd follow you to the moon. I smiled a little, which surprised me. I hadn't known I still had that available. The ham radio at 7, I said. Frequency 47.2. If Thomas Bellard is at the water treatment plant, he's been there for 12 days alone. We need to try to reach him. Frank nodded. I'll set it up when we get back. We went back the next morning. Dr. Marsh gave me a printed summary of her findings. Real paper, a full page, handwritten because the printer was conserving ink, and 2 vials of her own blood samples, and a request that I return in 3 weeks if possible. She also gave me a supply of broad-spectrum antibiotics that she had in surplus, which I accepted with more relief than I showed, because our antibiotic supply at 7 had been a quiet concern for days. She also told me something at the gate as we were leaving. She said it quickly, in a low voice, like she'd been deciding whether to say it, and chose to at the last second. The documentation suppression at Mercy General, she said. The administrative credentials that were used to block Dr. Okafor's access. I asked Kevin to look into it before you arrived. He was in hospital IT for 6 years, before he became a lab tech. The credentials that were used were registered to the hospital's chief medical officer, but the login occurred from an IP address registered to the contractor's regional office. I looked at her. The contractor had access to the hospital's administrative system, I said. The contractor had several hospital clients in the region, she said. Standard vendor access for certain health data analytics services they provided. Someone used that access in a specific way, deliberately suppressing the documentation. It appears so, she said. I thought about this for a long moment. The contractor in Atlanta, the modified chloramine compound with redacted safety data, the vendor access to hospital records, the anonymous call on the 20th, the notebook writer who'd known and run. The anonymous call, I said suddenly, the one your ID department got on the 20th. The caller who warned you about the contamination. That might have been Thomas Bellard. She looked at me. If it was, he was trying to warn us. And then the contractor found out he was talking, I said. And the documentation suppression was damage control. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She just looked at me with the expression of someone who has the same thought, and knows the limits of their ability to confirm it. "Find Bellard," she said. I got in the truck. The drive back to 7 was quieter than the drive out. Not because less was happening. I think more was happening in each of our heads. But because we'd moved past the phase where talking helps, and into the phase where you need the sounds to settle before you can speak about them. Gary sat in the jump seat where Robbie had sat on the way there and looked out the window at the city, with the expression of someone reading a map they made themselves. We got back to Station 7 at noon. Liz had kept everything running. The group had been tense. Frank had warned them we might be 2 days, and we'd been 2. But she'd managed it, and nobody had done anything irreversible. Kyle had organized a supply check, and we had enough food for another week if we were careful. Doug had fixed a structural issue with the side door that had been on my mental list for days. Robbie came to me when I walked in, and he looked at me and said, "How was it?" "Good," I said. "Strange. They want to run more tests on your blood. They're going to try to characterize what's different about your response." He nodded, looking at the floor, at some thought he was working through. "There were others, weren't there?" he said. Not a question. "In Birchwood," I said. "Possibly." He nodded again. "I thought so. When you were talking about that neighborhood, I thought, there must be others." He looked up. "Because I don't think I'm special. I think I'm just someone who happened to be exposed a certain way at a certain time." "I think that too," I said. "So there should be others." "Yes. We need to find them," he said. "They could be out there, not knowing." "We do," I said. "We will." That night, Brendan set frequency 47.2 to transmit instead of receive, and I sat at the desk radio and I said, "Thomas Bellard, if you're receiving this, my name is Joanna Kessler. I was a nurse at Mercy General. I'm at Fire Station 7 in the city. We've spoken with Vivian Marsh at Mercy Cross, and we've spoken with Gary Ostrowski. We found your notebook. We know what you know. Please respond." I said it 3 times. I waited. No response. I said it again at midnight. Nothing. At 3:47 in the morning, the radio came alive. Not a voice. Morse code again. Slow, deliberate, the same hand as the notebook. "Safe, plant, come when ready. Bring medical. I have something." I wrote it down. I stared at it. He was at the plant. He'd been at the plant this whole time, alone in Ground Zero, with something. Something he thought was worth bringing medical personnel to see. I didn't wake anyone else. I sat in the office in the dark with the radio, and I wrote back as best I could in a Morse code. I was remembering imperfectly from a certification course 8 years ago, and what I sent was approximately, "We read you. Coming soon. Stay safe." And then I sat back in the chair and I looked at the ceiling of the fire station office, which is white acoustic tile with a water stain in one corner, shaped roughly like a shoe. And I thought about my cat Gerald, and my sister in Portland, and 11 years of emergency medicine, and a morgue drawer with a broken latch, and Carl sitting on the floor with his hand pressed to his arm. I thought about the scrambled eggs I'd been planning to make at 2:14 in the morning 3 weeks ago. I thought about Nora and Tommy, wherever the helicopter had taken them, whether they'd made it to somewhere safe, whether a 9-year-old's post-surgical drain had been managed properly, whether Diane Greer was holding her son's hand somewhere and he still had his one sock. I thought about Dr. Okafor, whose documentation access had been suspended by a contractor's login, who had seen the cluster and tried to document it and been stopped, who might be alive somewhere and might not be. I thought about the water. The way water moves through a city, invisible and assumed, the thing you never think about until you think about it, and then you can't stop. How many glasses of it I'd drunk over the years without a moment's awareness of what it was, or where it came from, or who had made the decisions about what went into it. The complete, ordinary, life-sustaining assumption of clean water in a city. I thought about Thomas Bellard in the water treatment plant alone, with something he thought was worth our time. Kyle knocked on the office door at 6 in the morning, which is when the watch rotation changes. "Anything overnight?" he said. "Yes," I said. He looked at the notepad with the Morse code. "When do we go?" he said. He said we. He'd been saying we since that first night on the stairwell with 2 fire extinguishers, and his voice cracking on the word God. 22, from somewhere in Ohio, had been working nights for 4 months. Had no particular reason to still be here that I could identify, beyond the fact that here was where he was, and here was where the people he cared about were. "A few days," I said. "We need to resupply. I want to talk to Gary about the plant's layout. And I stopped. "What?" "I want to be ready to stay there," I said. "If what Bellard has is what I think it might be, we might not be coming back to 7. We might be going somewhere else after." Kyle thought about this. "Where?" "Outside the city," I said. "Outside the distribution network. To whatever is unaffected." He was quiet for a moment. "The group here," he said. "Do they know?" "Not yet," I said. "I need to talk to Brendan. He'll want to make a plan," Kyle said. "Good," I said. "So do I." I talked to Brendan that morning. Then I talked to the whole group. Everyone at Station 7, all 16 of us, minus Scott, who we'd lost on the walk from Parkview, gathered in the apparatus bay with Engine 7 and Ladder 7 behind us, and the roll-up doors cracked a foot for air, which was as much ventilation as we could safely allow. I told them about Mercy Cross, about Marsh's research, about Gary and the water treatment compound, about Thomas Bellard and frequency 47.2 and the Morse code, about Birchwood and what might be there and what it might mean, about the possibility, the slim, unproven, research-nascent possibility, that some people were not vulnerable to the bite the way others were, and that some of those people might not know. I said what I believed, that the city was not going to get better, that whatever it had been, it was becoming something else now, and the right move was eventually to be outside it, that the water treatment plant might have information that changed how we planned, that we had a path, plant first, then out. I said what I didn't know, almost everything else. I said that explicitly. I said I don't know if Bellard's information is what I think it is. I don't know the plant's current condition. I don't know how many turned are between here and there. I don't know what's outside the city. I don't know if Nora and Tommy made it wherever the helicopter took them. I don't know if my sister in Portland is okay. I said it and I watched the group sit with it. Then Robbie raised his hand. He'd been doing this, raising his hand in group discussions, and it was the kind of small habit that tells you everything about a person's instinct toward order. "Can I say something?" he said. "You never have to ask," I said. "I know," he said. "But it's a habit." He looked around at the group. "I've been in this station for 2 weeks, and none of you had to let me in. I had a bite. I showed up at your door, and you opened it, and the only person who had serious reservations about that had a valid reason to." And he set his reservations aside. He glanced at Doug, who looked at the floor. "I'm not trying to—" He stopped, started again. "I'm saying that what got me here was Joanna making a decision about me that was based on what she saw, not what she assumed. And I think that's the thing. I think that's the whole skill, the thing that keeps people alive." He paused. "I'll follow wherever this goes. That's all I wanted to say." 3 days later, we left for the water treatment plant. We went in 2 vehicles, Engine 7 and a pickup truck Doug had found 2 blocks away with keys in the ignition. And we took 9 people, me, Brendan, Frank, Liz, Kyle, Robbie, Gary, Doug, and a woman named Patricia Carroll, who was in her early 50s and had not said much since arriving at Station 7 8 days earlier, but who, it had emerged, was a licensed EMT who'd retired 5 years ago, and who Liz had quietly identified as one of the most competent people at the station. The remaining 7 stayed at Station 7 with food and the radio, and instructions for maintaining the watch rotation. The water treatment plant was 3 miles from the station. 3 miles, through the city's residential east side, through the edge of Birchwood. Birchwood was still empty, still intact. In the 18 days since the outbreak had started, the neighborhood had not been disturbed by anything visible. The window box flowers were dead now. They'd had nobody to water them, but the houses stood. The cars in the driveways hadn't moved. Gary was in the passenger seat of the truck, riding with Brendan, and he pointed out his street as we passed it. His house was small and white with a blue front door. The blue front door was closed. Through the front window, I could see the living room light was still on. We didn't stop. There was nothing to stop for. The plant entrance was a chain-link gate set in a fence along a service road. The gate was padlocked. Gary had a key. Not the same key he'd used when he worked there. That was on his key ring at his house, but a master key that the plant kept in a lockbox at an external maintenance station, and he knew the lockbox code. Inside the gate, the plant was quiet. Large industrial machinery, all stopped. Treatment tanks, processing equipment, the specific silence of machines that were designed to run continuously and had been halted without being designed for halting. The facility smelled like the chemical compound underneath the chemical compound. Whatever was in the water had its own scent, faint, not unpleasant, not identifiable. We found Thomas Bellard in the plant's monitoring room. He was alive. He was thin. 18 days alone, with whatever food had been in the break room cooler and whatever he'd managed to supplement it with, and his blue work jacket was exactly as Gary had described it. He was sitting at the monitoring console looking at us with an expression that I can only describe as the expression of someone who has been alone long enough that another human face has become, for a moment, almost impossible to process. He said my name. Joanna Kessler. Thomas Bellard, I said. He stood up and he was steadier than I expected him to be, given 18 days alone in Ground Zero. He looked around at the 9 of us, and his expression did several things very fast, and then settled into something solid and controlled. "I'm glad you came," he said. "There's something you need to see." What he showed us was in the plant's secondary monitoring room, which was connected to the environmental sampling network, the system of sensors that the plant uses to track water quality at multiple points in the distribution network. The sensors were still transmitting data. Not all of them. Some of the distribution sensors had gone offline in various parts of the city where infrastructure had failed, but enough of them to show a picture. The picture was this. In the distribution areas closest to the plant, the concentration readings for both the primary and secondary compounds were declining, steadily, without intervention. "How long?" I said. "At the current rate," Bellard said, "the primary compound in the distribution network will be below effective concentration in approximately 6 weeks. The secondary compound," he pointed to a different graph, "already below detectable threshold in the eastern distribution zone. It's unstable. It didn't maintain concentration the way the primary compound did." "It's running out," Brendan said. "It's degrading," Bellard said. "The compound is not stable over extended distribution time." I believe this was not anticipated by whoever introduced it. They put it in expecting a certain timeline, and the timeline is not what they expected. "What does that mean for the turned?" I said. Bellard looked at me. "I don't know. I'm an environmental engineer, not a biologist. But the compound that activated the cascade is degrading. Whether that affects the turned who already went through the cascade." He shook his head. "I can't tell you that. Dr. Marsh can," I said. I thought about it. "We need to get her this data. The monitoring system has a print function," Bellard said. "I printed these overnight. I've been printing the data every day for 18 days, waiting for someone who would know what to do with it." He went to a drawer and took out a stack of papers. Printouts, date-stamped, a timeline in numbers. I took the papers. I held them. 18 days of data from inside Ground Zero, collected by a man who'd gone into the plant alone with his notebook and his radio and his knowledge, and stayed. "You could have left," I said. "I could have," he said. "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because this is where the information is," he said simply. That was the whole answer, delivered without drama or pride. "Because the information is here, and so I stayed here. As simple as a nurse staying in a hospital because that's where the patients are." We stayed at the plant for 2 days. Not because it was comfortable. It wasn't. But because Bellard had set up a workable living situation in the monitoring room, and there was water available from a sealed reserve tank that predated the contamination, and the facility had a security perimeter that was intact, and for 2 days we had walls and data and the beginning of something that felt like understanding. On the second day, I tried the radio at 47.2 and reached Mercy Cross, and spoke with Dr. Marsh and read her the numbers from Bellard's printouts over the air. I could hear her on the other end writing. When I finished, there was a long pause. "This is consistent with my compound degradation model," she said. "If the data is accurate." "Thomas Bellard is the man who tracked this from the beginning," I said. "I trust the data." Another pause. "In 6 to 8 weeks," she said, "the distribution network in the affected areas should be safe to drink from again. The existing infected, the turned, will not reverse. Whatever transition occurred in them is biological and is not chemical in the same sense, but new transmission through the water will stop." "The bite vector," I said. "The bite vector is not reliable," she said. "As I've said, it's dangerous, obviously, but it's not the same mechanism. Without continued water contamination, the crisis will not continue to grow at the rate it has. A beat. If this is right, this is..." "I know," I said. "It doesn't undo." "I know," I said. "It doesn't undo anything." She was quiet for a moment. "Bring Bellard here when you can," she said. "Bring Gary." "I need both of them." "I will," I said. "A few weeks. We have things to manage at 7 first." "Are you well?" she said. A slightly different question from, "Are you okay?" which is why I noticed it. "I'm functional," I said. She made a sound that might have been a compressed version of understanding. "Come when you can," she said. We went back to Station 7 the following morning. The station was the same as we'd left it. The 7 people we'd left behind were all intact, all functional. Patricia had a working radio log from the 2 days that recorded several transmissions on various frequencies, including what sounded like a coordinated group about 30 miles north of the city, using the clear CB channels that Brendan had been monitoring. Organized, calm, making supply requests in ways that suggested they had infrastructure. Someone had worked something out up north. I am telling this story now, this recording, from the station. It's been 21 days since I was stapling incident reports in a nurse's station at 2 in the morning. It's been 21 days since Carl opened a door that shouldn't have opened, and Forsyth sat up, and the night shift at Mercy General ended forever. I have 14 people at Station 7, plus Bellard and Gary who are with me now, and will go to Marsh in a week or so, plus Liz and Frank who are the most reliable people I've ever worked alongside, plus Brendan, who keeps the whole structure standing by sheer functional authority, plus Kyle, who still carries things without being asked, and still shows up for his watch without prompting, plus Robbie, who is on day 21 since his bite, and has not turned, and has not shown a single symptom, and spends his evenings doing inventory, and his mornings checking in with people, to see how they're sleeping. Robbie's blood samples are at Mercy Cross. Marsh is working on them with what she has. I still have the Morse code note and the record of the Parkview survivors, and the notebook description, and Dr. Marsh's handwritten summary, and Bellard's 18 days of printouts. I have the Mercy General tablet with 3 weeks of admission records, and Dr. Okafor's suppressed consultation note. I have the name of a contractor in Atlanta. I have a list of frequencies. I do not know where my sister is. I am choosing to believe she is fine, and that choice is one of the things I do every morning, along with the medical checks and the watch rotation and the water rationing. I choose it every morning. Some mornings it's easier than others. The turned are still in the city, many of them. They aren't leaving, and they aren't dying, and they aren't improving. What they are is what they are now. Bodies running on reflex, moving towards sound, moving away from sound, existing without purpose or distress, or the specific kind of consciousness that makes existence anything more than persistence. I feel something about that I can't fully name. Not grief, not exactly, because the grief stage passed in the first days. Something flatter and more permanent, the knowledge of it. Last night, on watch by the front bay door, I heard one of them in the street. One, moving past, maybe 30 feet out, making the low sound. Moving north, not toward anything I could identify, just moving. It passed and was gone, and the street was quiet again. I watched it through the window until it was out of sight. There is a word I've been avoiding in this recording, because it feels too large, and I don't want to give it the wrong weight. The word is hope. Not because hope is present in some overwhelming or easy way, but because it's there in the specific way that small true things are there. In Marsh's compound degradation model, in Bellard's declining concentration graphs, in the radio traffic from 30 miles north, in Robbie's 21-day blood panel that keeps coming back within normal range, in the fact that the city outside my window has a lot of dark buildings, and also a lot of windows that still have light. It's there, the way data is there. Not comforting, not warm, just accurate. I think about the Birchwood neighborhood, still intact, silent and ordinary, the blue front door closed and the lights on inside. I think about the people who might have been exposed early, before the secondary compound, who felt strange, and then felt better, and didn't know why, who walked north because the turn came through their streets and drove them out, who are somewhere outside the city right now, in exactly the condition Robbie is in, not knowing. We have to find them. That's the next thing. That's the thing after the plant visit and Marsh's lab, and the frequency monitoring, and the watch rotations, and the carefully rationed cans in the storage room. We have to find the people in Birchwood. And I have to find Thomas Bellard a full meal, because the man has been alone for 18 days on vending machine crackers, and he is being politely stoic about it in a way that I recognize from the ER, the polite stoicism of someone who is used to enduring things and has stopped expecting the endurance to be noticed. Tonight I will make him something from the catering delivery we've been rationing since Parkview, something actual. He can eat it at the station's kitchen table, which is the closest thing to a table worth sitting at that any of us have had access to in 3 weeks. And he can tell me more about the monitoring system and what else the sensors showed in the first days, before the cascade. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to do. That's all I've got for now. Joanna Kessler, RN. Station 7, Day 21. The light through the bay door crack is the specific pale gray that comes before sunrise. And from somewhere past the quiet streets, there's a bird. Not a significant bird, not a metaphor, just a bird, singing in the pre-dawn the way birds do when the light changes, and they respond to the light without knowing why, because that's what their nervous system does, because some things just continue. I can hear it. That's the whole recording. I don't know who finds this, or when. I don't know what the next weeks look like. We have a plan, and plans change, and that's fine. I've been in emergency medicine long enough to know that the plan is what you have, until the situation has a different plan. And then you adapt, and then you keep going, because what else is there? If you're listening to this from somewhere safe, good. Stay there if you can. If you're not somewhere safe, find Brendan Calloway's radio signal on 147.3 megahertz and say you heard this recording, and someone will answer. If you're medical personnel, a nurse, a paramedic, a doctor, anyone, we need you. Station 7, east side of the city. Come the north way around. Avoid the main hospital zones. And if you're from Birchwood, or you were exposed early, or you've been bitten and you're still fine, and you don't know what that means, it means something. It means something that might matter a great deal. Come find us. Kessler out. End of recording. Jack. I want to add one more thing. Not on the recording because I stopped recording, but I need to say it somewhere. Kyle knocked on the office door this morning with 2 cups of coffee. Real coffee. The last of the station's supply, which we'd been rationing for days, and he'd made 2 cups instead of 1, and brought me the second one without asking, and set it on the desk without saying anything, and then gone back to his watch rotation. I drank it slowly. It was hot. It was the best cup of coffee I have ever had in my life, and I know how that sounds, but I mean it in the simplest possible way. It was hot, and it was there, and someone had made it for me, and handed it over, and that's the whole thing. That's the whole sentence. Hot coffee on day 21 in a fire station in a city that is not what it was, handed to me by a 22-year-old from Ohio who came to this job 4 months ago and stayed.